Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program. Impact of the 2022 OSTP Memo, the current state of U.S. federally funded research and how universities can prepare for a more open future, which is sponsored by Dimensions, part of Digital Science. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version and where to access the slides. With that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Shannon.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you, ACRL Choice, for hosting us today. Before I begin, I just want to mention that the information shared in this webinar is openly available, including my co-presenter Eric's study, which will feature prominently in today's webinar. Slides, as well as a list of resources, will be provided to all attendees after the presentation tomorrow. I want to provide a quick look at the agenda for today. I'll start by unpacking the recent OSTP Nelson memo and provide background on Dimensions, which was the main data source for our next bullet point, the impact of the OSTP memo, a bibliometric analysis of U.S. federally funded publications from 2017 to 2021. We'll then take a look behind the data with Eric, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers after our presentations today. My name is Shannon O'Reilly, and I'm a product specialist with Dimensions and Altmetric, part of Digital Science. I'm excited to have with us Eric Schares, the Engineering and Collection Analysis Librarian at Iowa State, and the author of the Impact of the 2022 OSTP Memo, a bibliometric analysis of U.S. federally funded publications from 2017 to 2021, published recently on MIT Press Direct. Featured organizations on today's webinar are Dimensions and Iowa State University. As promised by the agenda, I'm going to start off by providing background on OSTP. What is it? Where is this memo coming from? With a particular focus on the 2022 Nelson memo. There's been a lot of buzz around the OSTP Nelson memo, but rarely do we talk about where this memo is coming from, which is why I want to start with what OSTP stands for. OSTP is the Office of Science and Technology Policy, established by the National Science and Technology Policy Organization and Priorities Act of 1976. To use the language from the White House, OSTP aims to harness the power of science, technology, and innovation to achieve America's greatest aspirations. 6 core teams comprise OSTP, covering priorities from climate to energy to science and society. It's worth noting the OSTP's mission, as much of it will serve as a backbone for the 2013 Holdren memo and the 2022 Nelson memo. Parts of the OSTP mission that are particularly relevant are strengthening and advancing of American science and technology, the creation of bold visions, unified strategies and equitable programs, the engagement of external partners, both government and academic, and the assurance of equity, inclusion, and integrity in all aspects of science and technology. These are some lofty goals, and which brings us to the present, the 2022 OSTP Nelson memo. On August 25th, 2022, not too long ago, the OSTP released a memo regarding public access to scientific research. It was signed by Director Alondra Nelson. This updated guidance eliminated the 12-month embargo period on publications arising from U.S. federal funding. This had been previously allowed from a previous 2013 OSTP memo, the Holdren memo. Already, we're seeing a shift globally from closed to open access research. The Nelson memo will help see this trend advance rapidly in the United States, with the stipulation that federally funded publications and associated datasets should be made publicly available without an embargo period. Before we talk in more detail about the reactions to the memo, let's first look at what it means potentially for institutions and faculty by unpacking the memo's three main clauses. The first clause of the memo, and arguably the most impactful to academic institutions, is focused on ensuring federal funders have policies in place to provide embargo-free public access to research. The second clause encourages the development of transparent procedures to ensure scientific and research integrity is maintained in public access policies. This is a complex and interesting space, which goes beyond the remit of what we would perhaps traditionally think of as open access, by incorporating elements such as transparency of data, conflicts of interest, funding, and reproducibility. The third clause recommends that federal agencies coordinate with the OSTP in order to ensure equitable delivery of federally funded research results in data. While the first clause mentions making supporting data available alongside publications, this clause takes a broader stance towards sharing results. I already briefly mentioned how the OSTP Nelson memo differs from the 2013 Holdren memo, but it's worth looking into the differences in more detail to understand the full extent of the 2022 Nelson memo. The biggest change that, as already mentioned, is the elimination of the 12-month embargo period. Research must be made freely available and publicly accessible immediately in agency-designated repositories. The 2022 memo also applies to all agencies, where previously the Holdren memo only applied to those that were over 100 million in R&D budget. We also see an extension in content types that are covered by the 2022 memo. We go beyond peer-reviewed manuscripts to include book chapters, editorials, conference proceedings. Research data must also be immediately accessible upon publication. And in addition, we have machine readability formats. So more specificity in terms of accessibility than what was stated in the Holdren memo. Metadata is covered by both memos, but again, we have more detail in the 2022 memo with a call out to persistent identifiers for research, sources of funding, and research outputs, along with specified metadata requirements. Last, the 2022 memo covers reuse rights and digital repository access, an area our sister company Figshare is recommended for. There's also a timeline to these recommendations, which we can see on the next slide. Already, public access policies were due for federal agencies with more than 100 million in R&D expenditures. We saw this in February of this year. Coming up will be public access policies for federal agencies with less than 100 million. So again, that extension covering more federal agencies under the Nelson memo. Final public access policies are due at the end of 2024 and are to go into effect in 1 year after publication, so December 2025. There is some time, especially for academic institutions and faculty evaluating how this memo will impact their research and work processes. Unfortunately, there isn't a clear path forward yet for how academic institutions will respond in terms of data management, sharing, institutional infrastructure, and research support, just to name a few. Although many questions remain, reactions so far have been positive, especially when considering the potential benefits of the memo. I'm going to turn for this to Spark, a nonprofit advocacy organization, which provides a nice summary of some of these benefits. The OSTP Nelson memo makes taxpayer-funded research publications available immediately, which leads to it being more useful and valuable. This improves scientific research integrity. It increases the public trust in federally funded research. It promotes equity in the research enterprise, and extends the scope and reach of current policy, which we see moving from Holdren to Nelson Memo. It builds on 15 years of steady progress, and it aligns with UNESCO's recent recommendation on open science. So all good things. We are already seeing clear indications that funders are embracing the recommendations and preparing next steps. Rapidly after the announcement, the NIH published a statement of support for the policy, noting that it has long championed principles of transparency and accessibility in NIH-funded research, and supports this important step by the Biden administration. And over the coming months, it'll work with interagency partners and stakeholders to revise its current public access policy to enable researchers, clinicians, students, and the public to access NIH research results immediately upon publication. Faculty are also, for the most part, responding positively to the shift towards open data and open research, although with some concerns. 88% of researchers think OA articles should be common practice, and 79% think research data should be openly available. And this is coming from the State of Open Data 2022 report, co-authored by our partners at Figshare. There is this concern around the lack of time when it comes to compliance to data management plans. So there is still work to be done in terms of building an infrastructure to support researchers. I'll also mention, according to a brief questionnaire conducted by the Association of Research Libraries, ARL, that top of mind for the library community as we start thinking about open science and open research is the cost of data management sharing and resourcing institutional infrastructure, such as institutional repositories and staffing. So there's a lot to think about as we watch federal agencies publish their open access policies and the academic community prepares for a more open future. So beginning to think about enabling open access at your institution can be a daunting task, particularly for institutions who don't yet have internal workflows or appropriate infrastructure set up. To make this more manageable, a first step in the focus of our webinar today is understanding the open access landscape in the state of federally funded research for the US, and then subsequently seeing what this looks like at your own institution. Luckily for you, we have Eric with us today, where he'll be walking us through his bibliometric analysis of US federally funded publications from 2017 to 2022. Eric realized there hadn't been a detailed analysis of the publications that would fall under the new Nelson Memo framework. The OSTP released a companion report along with the memo, but only provided a broad estimate of total numbers of publications affected per year. To truly understand the memo's impact, there needed to be more data, more research. For his study, Eric used dimensions to identify and analyze publications with federal funding sources. And because of this, I want to provide a quick, brief background on dimensions before we dive into Eric's work. Dimensions is part of digital science, a portfolio of solutions and resources that cover all stages of the research lifecycle with the larger goal of advancing the research ecosystem, making it more open, collaborative, and inclusive as possible. Similar mission, as you could say, to the OSTP. All of our companies are founded by researchers for research's stakeholders. And you may recognize a few of them on this slide, such as Figshare, Altmetric, or Symplectic Elements. Today, we're focusing on Dimensions, a linked research knowledge system. Informally, we like to call it a database on steroids that brings together multiple content types into a single place for improved global discovery and analysis. Dimensions recognizes that the research ecosystem is much more than just publications. Content is generated pre-publication. There's lots of activities such as grants, data sets, conference proceedings, and preprints. Even before citations accrue, we also have online attention like social media, news mentions, and Wikipedia, which is also captured by Dimensions via Altmetric. We, of course, have citations, but we're also looking at post-publication activities such as clinical trials, patents, and policy documents. Looking at all of these content types, we get a much broader and richer picture of the research ecosystem. It's one thing to bring all this content together. It's another thing to connect it. This visual gives you a sense of where we're making these connections between different content types. And I'll note these connections can go both ways. For instance, you can see which patents and policy documents are citing publications, or you can look at a grant record and see the resulting publications. This is particularly handy when you want to see resultant publications from US federal funded grants. A little tease to Eric's portion of the webinar. In addition to making connections, Dimensions also enriches and organizes the data in several ways. We disambiguate institutions, we apply research categorizations on a record level, we extract concepts, we disambiguate people and extract references. What you get at the end of that enrichment process is a cleaner set of metadata that is a lot easier to navigate, whether you're using it for discovery or analysis. You have a number of options for using and navigating Dimensions data. For the purpose of today's webinar, we'll be looking at the Dimensions web application, an online search and discovery platform that you can use directly from your browser with no specialized knowledge required. Eric will be giving us a preview of the web application shortly as part of his presentation. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Great. Thank you, Shannon. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Eric Schares, Engineering and Collection Analysis Librarian at Iowa State University. And I'm going to talk about this research study that I did on the impact of the OSTP memo, a bibliometric analysis of US federally funded publications 2017 through 2021. You try to have a descriptive title, but then when you have to read it out loud, you realize that, hey, this is actually pretty long. So Shannon did a really nice job setting the stage for us with some background on what the OSTP is, what the OSTP memo is, how the new release is different from the previous 2013. And so it was announced in August of 2022 to go into effect by 2026. So that's really only 2.5 years from now, which might seem long, but with the scale of change this will likely bring, I would argue it's not really that much time at all. So it's good to start thinking about these things now. So when this was announced last summer, I saw lots of reactions from folks, all types of people in scholarly communications, in academic publishing and libraries. Many pixels were spilled with reactions and predictions. And I saw things from individual librarians, universities, consortia, publishers, consultants, so on, all kind of giving their reaction. But what I didn't see was very much actual analysis. I wish someone would tell me how many papers does this affect per year? Are we talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of papers per year? What is the magnitude of the scope? How do those papers break down by publisher, by individual journal title? Which institutions are those authors that tend to publish federally funded research affiliated with? And how are those federally funded papers being published in the first place? Are they already being published in some form of open access, or are they behind a paywall and closed? And so that's what I did. That's the focus of my research study that I'm going to present to you today, basically to look at the characteristics of this US federally funded research over a 5-year period to better understand this updated guidance's impact. And so these are the research questions I'm going to talk about today. Shannon also did a really nice job introducing you to Dimensions, the data source that I used for this study. Dimensions has a lot of great strengths. It does have some limitations, just like any other bibliometric or metadata database, but the specific strengths that Dimensions brings really helped me with the study that I wanted to do. So that's why I chose Dimensions. On the left side, you can see the actual search query that I used. So you can see that I'm limiting my years from 2017 to 2021. I've got preprints removed. The publication type preprint has been taken out. And that's because the OSTP memo specifically states that it applies to peer-reviewed scholarly outputs. Preprints are early versions of journal articles before peer review. And so I removed those from my analysis. It should be noted that there are more recent initiatives to provide reviews to preprints before they get submitted to say, a journal. Things such as Peer Community In or pre-review, Review Commons, but these were maybe not as active over the years that I'm studying now. So I did elect to go ahead and remove preprints from this study. I also have a country of funder set to United States. And then that yellow box, that US, yes, federal funders, was my own custom funder group that I'll talk about quite a lot on the next slide. So with this search query, the search criteria set up, you can see I returned 1.3 million publications in Dimensions. And another nice thing that I like about Dimensions is it has these things called analytical views that fly out from the right-hand side of your screen. And that's the screenshot on the right-hand side of this graph, or of this slide. So I'm looking at the publisher's facet within the analytical views. And what these things, these views do is it really does a nice job of giving you an overview, a group by of all the publications that meet your criteria. How do those break down by, in this case, publisher? And so you might or may not be able to read what you see Elsevier, Springer Nature, Wiley, IEEE, and so on, ordered by decreasing number of publications. And I've got the top 500 ready to go for me right there. If you follow over a little bit farther to that circled link that says export table, with one click, it exports to a CSV or an Excel file. And now I've got a nice summary of these 1.3 million publications and how they break down in this example again by publisher. So makes it really easy to export your data to move on to kind of your next step in your data analysis workflow. And I should mention that I ran this analysis on October 18th, 2022. And so if you run this again today, that number is going to be a little higher. That 1.3 million is up to, I think, 1.4 million now. That's just because over time, Dimensions adds more and more publications and connections to their database. So I mentioned that funder facet, that funder group that I had to create. Really, that's kind of the bulk of this work, is to define the scope of what publications I want to look at. What are those publications that acknowledge some form of US federal funding? And really the problem statement here is that funder information is not always included in the metadata. So when you mint a new DOI, a new digital object identifier, so when the publisher goes to Crossref, say, which is a place you can go to get a DOI, I'd say maybe the most common place for academic journal articles. Crossref has fields that you need to fill out to describe your journal article or your book chapter, whatever the case may be, before they'll give it a DOI. Funder information is included in there, but it's not required. So you are of course allowed to include funder information, but it's not a requirement to get the DOI. And so what happens in practice is oftentimes that funder information is just left blank. Crossref is the starting point, and Dimensions inherits what it can from Crossref. But if that funder information is missing, then it's going to show up as blank in Dimensions as well. Dimensions has done a good job, I think, trying to do some workarounds, right? So they will also analyze the acknowledgments section of a paper. That's what the screenshot here is trying to show. So the acknowledgments is generally where authors will make their funding declarations, right? So this one acknowledges the National Institute of Health and gives the grant number there. So Dimensions would pick up on that with natural language processing and say, oh, I see NIH, so I'm going to add that to the record of this particular article. I think Dimensions also has agreements with some publishers to obtain additional funding information on top of what they get from Crossref. So they try to further enrich what they get and offer that funding information for folks like me to study. And so what I was able to do was define a custom group of 239 US federal funding agencies, and I added those one by one to this custom funder group that I can then use in the previous slide to construct my search query. I do cite a couple of studies in my article that go deeper into investigating the availability of funder metadata. So if that's something that interests you, there's some good work being done in that area. But I removed all private foundations, 501c3s, corporations, nonprofits, things that were not US federal funding. And really, another big problem in constructing this is the fact that if authors acknowledge their funding and they do it in a way that Dimensions can detect, there is no standardized rule on what level they acknowledge. So it could be something as small as a sub-agency, a directorate, an individual center or institute or program, or it could be like the larger umbrella organization that rolls up multiple of these institutes and programs together. So for example, the National Cancer Institute, I'm sure does excellent work. They are one of 27 institutes under the National Institute of Health, and the NIH itself is one of 11 institutes under the Department of Health and Human Services. So the NIH, the FDA, all of those are under HHS. So if you were to ask me, how many of these papers were the result of overall Health and Human Services funding, I don't have an answer because I don't know enough about the way federal funding agencies and directorates and centers break down to reunify that back together. If someone out there is more knowledgeable about that than me, that is something I'd be interested in learning more about. If you can, reunify this kind of fractured and inconsistent practice of authors acknowledging and citing maybe something as granular as a single program or as wide as the NIH, as we see in this screenshot here. It should be noted that part of the new OSTP memo is to provide that structure and standardize. That's section 4A reads that agencies should collect and make publicly available appropriate metadata. Such metadata should include, at a minimum, all author and co-author names, affiliations, and sources of funding, referencing digital persistent identifiers as appropriate. So this would certainly help clean up, again, this kind of inconsistent and fractured and granular approach that we have now. Okay, so that's a long introduction to what I think is the good stuff. In just a minute, we're going to go to the live website and start to look at the actual data. I want to take a minute here to explain how the data is going to appear and transparently justify my decisions behind how I chose to plot this data, because it maybe not as you expect it to look. So we're going to look for this example at publishers. We're going to later on we'll look at publishers and journal article or journal titles and universities, and those will follow the same format. But for this example, we're going to focus just on publishers here. So once I've exported all that data from Dimensions, I've defined my scope, I've exported the data out. Now I want to compare and see, do I see any patterns based on publisher, for example? So I'm going to plot the total number of publications worldwide over the 5 years of my study on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis here. And that's going to include federal funding, that's going to include non-federal funding, that's going to include papers from other countries around the world that a global publishing company produces. So the total number is going to be on the X. And then on the Y, the vertical axis will be the number of US federally funded papers. So that's what's limited down to the scope that I showed before, that 1.3 million number. And so we're going to put 500 dots on this graph, and each point, each dot is going to represent a publisher. If we go to the next slide, oops, I lost my control. We go here, and it doesn't look great. It looks pretty bad, actually. The problem here is we've got a data point way off far upper right corner that's really skewing this entire graph, and it's hard to look at what's going on anywhere else in this graph. So this one way up here in the corner turns out to be Elsevier. It publishes over 3.5 million. It published over 3.5 million articles worldwide over the 5 years in my study, and of those, over 250,000 had US federal funding. That's the vertical distance. This trend line runs through all 500 points and tries to kind of describe the relationship or the association between the X and the Y. A measure of the goodness of fit of this regression or this trend line is 0.93. And so it's actually a pretty strong correlation. A perfect line would be 1. And so this is an R squared of 0.93. So that actually does describe the relationship pretty well. So as you tend to publish more publications overall, you also tend to publish more publications with US federal funding. If you draw kind of an imaginary line at 1 million on the x-axis, 1 million total, I've only got 5 data points out there over 1 million total publications, again, in this data set over these 5 years. And so that means I have 495 dots down here in this lower left corner that are kind of squashed, and I can't really read or see what's going on. Only 1% of our data is out there past 1 million, and 99% of my data is down here in this lower left corner. That makes it really hard to read. And so my solution is I'm going to change the x-axis to log. So now I'm taking the log of the total number of publications instead of just showing it in linear scale. And what this will do is this stretches out the x-axis to let me see. It allows me more visibility into what's going on in that lower left-hand corner. And so now it's the exact same data, but you can see we've got multiples of 10 on the x, and each individual distance on the x-axis is no longer the same amount, right? It's not a linear scale anymore. And so now we can see a little more what's going on. The problem is we've got the same issue on the y-axis. So if you draw a line at maybe 50,000 articles, I have 6 publishers over 50,000, and that means 494 dots are squished down below my first grid line. And so I can't really read what's going on down there. And so I have the same problem. So I'm going to do the same solution and take the y, or the log of the y-axis as well. And this is the final form now. This is how I'm going to present my results in just maybe 2 more minutes. Now I've started to introduce some data labels. So each one of these data points, again, in this example, is a publisher. I can't turn all the data labels on because they're too clustered together. They're going to start to overlap and become unreadable. So I have to be kind of selective on which ones I label when I do these static screenshots. Let's see what else I want to say. So these are no longer linear scales, right? It can be kind of hard to have a sense of what an increase means. But this trend line is the same one as before. This is still a 0.93 r squared. All the data is the same. It's just that I messed with the axes, and I did that because I wanted to be able to see what's going on in this lower left-hand corner. If you really liked the way we jump back one. If you really like the way this looks, I do have a radio toggle on the website that will change that y-axis back to linear. So that's a choice that you can make and jump back and forth. But this is how I prefer to show it. So this is how I'm going to talk about the data today. It's going to look like this. Okay. So everything I'm going to show today is provided in more detail in this journal article. It's published in Quantitative Science Studies. The DOI is listed here. I think it also went into the chat. And you're welcome to read that article. If it interests you, I'm happy to answer questions about it, either today or if you're watching this on a recording. My email will be provided at the end. It had been accepted for publication in the journal since January, and it had been in what they call early view, which means it's like a preliminary release before like an official volume and issue. And in an almost unbelievable coincidence, it was this morning that it became published in the final issue version. And so so now it's like the final version is out as of like 9 a.m. this morning. So so I thought that was kind of funny. In this paper, all the graphs that I just showed, right, similar things, those are all static, right? It's just a screenshot in a PDF file. And again, I can't label all the points. I can't really show you everything that's going on in there. And so I did make this companion website, and that's what we're going to go to right after this, ostp.lib.iastate.edu. And that has all the same graphs as the journal article, but everything is live and interactive. And then I have openly published all the data, all the code. So everything I exported out of Dimensions, all those summaries, all the code that I used to create this interactive website, all of that is up on GitHub at this GitHub repository that you are also free to explore and look around if that interests you as well. Okay, so I'm going to jump into screen share now. And there we go. So you should see, yep, good. So you should see a website, a white website with bold lettering, Impact, the 2022 OSTP memo, that really long title that we went through a couple times already. So this is the companion website. We're going to spend about 20 minutes in here just walking through and kind of showing different things that I find interesting about how this data came out. The link to the journal article is provided here again. And again, my contact information is right there at the top. So if you ever have questions, either again right now or later on as you read the article or watch the recording, I'm happy to take those. So we start with just kind of an about. This is a really shortened version of a lot of the good stuff that Shannon talked about at the beginning. kind of the motivation of the background behind how this idea came to be. And then how to use tries to kind of lay out the structure of the website, what we're going to talk about. So we'll look at publishers, and then journal titles, research universities or institutions, and then we'll talk about open access status at the bottom. But if we dive right into it, so the first kind of heading that I have is the number. So what is that number that we talked about at the beginning? So it was 1.3 million publications, as we saw when I ran this in October of 2022. And this is the breakdown by year. And so the 5-year average is about 265,000 publications per year. You can see it does kind of increase as we go along in time. Maybe it kind of evens out here in 2021. But over these 5 years, the average number that would have fallen under the OSTP memo is 265,000. This total of 1.3 million over these 5 years represents 33% of all US domestic research output. So about a third of papers coming out of the US, again, over these 5 years, acknowledge some form of US federal funding. And that same number represents 4.5% of total global research output. So 4.5% of all papers published worldwide over these 5 years acknowledge some form of US federal funding. So those are the papers that would fall under this updated 2022 OSTP guidance. So that's the raw number. Let's start to look at how it breaks down by publisher, right? Because publishers vary in the subject matter they produce. And so the impact of this new guidance will affect publishers to different degrees. And so the way I've kind of organized the website is, we've got kind of a heading here. This checkbox, you can always click this to show the raw data behind the graphs. And so if that interests you, right, we've got 500 rows, one publisher per row. Here's the number of federally funded publications over these 5 years. Here's the rank. So this has the most federally funded publications of these 500. Here's the number of worldwide. Here's the rank. Here's the percentages. Here's a bunch of open access data and details that we'll talk about in just a second. So you can always click that and expand it and look at the raw data that's going on behind these charts. This part I'll talk about in just a second. But now let's first look at by absolute number. And this is the exact same graph that I showed, that I built slide by slide in the first part of the talk. So the only difference now is everything is live. So I can roll around and I can look and what's this publisher? Okay, blah, blah, blah. You can click and zoom, so you can reset the zoom, double click to reset back to the original view. I can come up here and select pan, and now I can, when I click and drag, instead of making a zoom box, now it's a pan box. So if I want to kind of come out here, I can do so. Again, double click to reset. Change it back to zoom. And then here's the toggle to change the y-axis from log back to linear. If I click that, the graph will update and look different. But as I said, I prefer it to be a log plot because I think it makes it easier to see what's going on. So you've got this trend line running through. So publishers appearing above the trend line maybe are publishing more federally funded papers than you might otherwise expect from the trend line. What happened there? Oh, I see. I was still on the radio button. Sorry. I hit my up arrow because I want to try. So if I were to say, here's a publisher that publishes 100,000 papers total, what do you guess would be the number of federally funded papers? You would probably want to guess whatever is right on this trend line, right? Because that takes all 500 publishers into account. So you might guess something like 5,000, whereas APS would actually be 29,000 out of that 100,000 total worldwide. So maybe Wiley, maybe ACS, APS, Geophysical Union, American Astronomical Society, those might publish more federally funded papers than you might otherwise expect because they're higher up on the graph. I should have mentioned also. So as you're looking around in here, maybe for your favorite publisher or maybe someone that you work with or work for, but you don't want to, let's say, we're looking for the American Society for Cell Biology, but I don't want to go in here and try to hunt around, you can come up here to this search box, American Society for Cell Biology. I can select that and I can say, find that publisher. I click that. That's going to turn that specific dot red, and it will turn the data label on. So now it's easier to see where that publisher lands, and that will stay red on the next graph as well. So easier to highlight something that you're looking for. I think you should be able to put in more than one if you wanted to highlight things. When you refresh the page, you'll lose that customization and it'll go back to all blue. So just a note. So it might be tempting to say that publishers that appear above the trend line or higher up in the graph than the trend line will be more affected by this new guidance, since they publish more papers that are going to fall under this new zero embargo with immediate public access. The problem with that is, again, this is only showing absolute numbers of publications, and the X and Y axes are on a log scale. So it's hard to figure out the exact proportion of articles that are federally funded, because these scales do not linearly increase. And so what we do then is we move down here and we look at by percentage. So now these are the same exact 500 dots. You can see American Society for Cell Biology retained its data label in its red color. But now we're looking at percentage of publications that are federally funded on the y-axis. And so we can see most publishers are falling somewhere down here between 0 and 20%. And maybe 20 to 40 is kind of the next group. And then we have over 40%. I think this is 21 out of 500 publishers are over 40%. So in general, the highest percentage of federally funded research is among publishers that have relatively low total volume, and that makes sense, right? So if you have just one more federally funded paper, that's going to affect your percentage more than if when you publish 100 articles over these 5 years, than if you publish 3 million articles over these 5 years. But here again, we can see the American Astronomical Society, eLife, having somewhat high percentages of federally funded articles. But new publishers kind of jump to the top. So this International Ocean Discovery Program, I'm not familiar with this particular publisher, but nearly 100% of the material that they publish acknowledges some form of US federal funding. National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, American Society for Clinical Investigation. These are our top 3, 4 or 5 or so. Of the publishers that publish over 50%, and that's about this box that I'm highlighting here, the American Astronomical Society is the highest volume publisher that has over half of its material acknowledge some form of US federal funding. And that was 24,500 articles in the American Astronomical Society. Okay, so lots to look at. I mean, we could spend all day, asking questions, exploring things, comparing this versus that. I should say, up above, we had those really high volume publishers, Elsevier, Wiley, Springer, were way out in the top right corner. It looked like they published a lot of federally funded research, but they publish a lot of research overall, right? These are high volume. And once you take the percentages, they're down in the 10%, right? Taylor and Francis at 3%. So overall, it's a relatively modest percentage of their portfolio. But again, that is taking into account all publications worldwide, not just US. Okay, so that's our look at publishers, and that's going to be kind of the same pattern we're going to use now for the next 2 topics, journal titles and then universities. So now, I'm going to scroll back up, instead of looking at, say, Wiley as a whole, what if I broke Wiley apart into its individual journals and looked at the performance of them that way? So that's what we're going to do. Scroll back down, now we have journal titles as kind of our heading, that's what we're talking about. Same exact thing. We could turn this on and look at the data behind the graphs. If this was interesting to you, you can always explore that. We can label a journal and turn it red on the charts. Maybe, I don't know, let's go. turn one of these on, find that journal. I should turn, okay, that happened to be near one, but I could zoom in and say, well, how close is it, and so on. Double click to reset the view. But now let's look at the signature of these journals. So scientific reports, PLOS One way out here. These are both publish a very high number of federally funded research, but they also, again, publish a very high number of articles in general. IEEE Access is one of the largest volume in this set, but it actually publishes a relatively small amount of federally funded research. Nature Communications, Proceedings, Astrophysical Journal, this kind of area up here are more than you might expect from the trend line. But again, the same kind of problem is it's hard to make a comparison when you're looking in absolute numbers and the axes are not linear. So we're going to move from this to percentages, just the same way we looked at the publishers. So here again, we see the same type of trend that we saw with the publishers. So the higher percentages are with the relatively lower total volume. This one is a little more filled in. It was a little more scattered up with the publishers. This one is kind of a smoother curve with dots kind of all over inside here. More titles are present at the greater than 40% range, with 120 out of 500 at greater than 40%. And then if we look at greater than 50%, I think this is 64 journals have more than half of their material, again, over these 5 years, with some form of US federal funding acknowledged. Here we have AIDS and Behavior, JCI Insight, the Astronomical Journal with the highest percentages, all over 70%. And those high volume destinations over here, PLOS One, scientific reports, are down around 15, 16%. Lecture Notes Computer Science is at 5%, and IEEE Access is at 3% of federally funded research. Moving now to research institutions or universities, or we can always show the raw data behind. This should open up. Good. What I see, again, we see kind of the same trend. This one is an R squared of 0.92, so very similar to the strength that we saw in the publishers. The journal articles was, I'm going to scroll up here for a moment. Journal articles was an R squared of 0.44. Or journal titles was an R squared of 0.44. So that relationship was quite a bit weaker. And here for research institutions, we see the R squared is much stronger. But this is maybe what you're more interested in, right? How can my individual specific campus cope with this, or how will we be affected by the updated memo? I should note that this graph shows universities from around the world also. So universities other than those in the United States will also be affected by this memo, because when publishing research collaboratively, if you're on a paper with a researcher that receives some federal funding from U.S. granting agencies, that paper will need to that paper does fall. It qualifies under the updated guidance and will need to be made publicly available immediately. So you might, as you explore in here, you have Zurich, Edinburgh, down in here, Oslo. So universities outside of the U.S. will appear here, but it is a vast undercount. It is nowhere close to being comprehensive for those particular universities. This will only reflect those papers published jointly with someone in the United States, if that makes sense. So what jumps out to me on this graph was the appearance over here of these kind of 3 labs that publish quite a bit more than you might expect from the trend line. So Lawrence Berkeley, Oak Ridge, and Argonne National Labs. And it makes sense that more of their research is a result of federal funding because the labs themselves are the results of federal funding. And when we move from absolute numbers on this graph down to percentage, as we have in the last 2 examples, we see something pretty striking jump out. All these in this call out box up here, these are all national laboratories hovering around 80 to 90%. So Lawrence Berkeley, Oak Ridge, Livermore, right, Fermilab, all these, I couldn't, again, label all these because they would all kind of run into each other and you wouldn't be able to read them. So I put a box around it and just said, these are all the national laboratories up here. Most universities are somewhere in this 40 to 60, maybe 30 to 60% down around here. I did highlight Iowa State just because I had an interest in that. But you can spend time in here looking around at maybe your peer institutions or using that search and turn your specific campus red and better understand maybe how your local situation will be affected by the OSTP guidance. Okay, so now we're going to kind of break from the pattern here. We looked at publishers, we looked at journal titles, and we looked at research institutions, both in absolute numbers and in percentages. We're going to stop with that for a minute. We're going to move on to a different topic, open access status, right? So of these 1.3 million federally funded articles over these 5 years, how were those published? Were they already published open access? Were they published closed? Right, that question is still outstanding. In what manner were they published? So what we're looking at here is a stacked bar graph. Year is on the bottom, so 17 runs vertically, 2018, 19, 20, and 21. And we have closed access, green, gold, bronze, and hybrid are the stacks going up. So I get this information from Unpaywall, which integrates directly into Dimensions. Unpaywall will provide the open access status of an article at the time that I run the analysis. So there are some caveats to be aware of with Unpaywall and open access data in general. But this should all be apples to apples because it was all run on the exact same day. You may or I guess may not be familiar with all these different open access types. That I don't have time to run through all the differences of the different colors, but what I want to call your attention to first is this gray bar on the bottom of each stack, right? This is closed. This is behind a paywall. So about a quarter of federally funded research from 17 to 2020 are still closed. And then in 2021, it jumps up to almost a third of federally funded research still closed and behind a paywall. This is the material that's going to be affected the most by this updated guidance. This will no longer, be allowed. There will be no gray in these bars after 2026. It will all need to be made openly available, publicly available immediately in either probably green, perhaps gold. 2021 increases to nearly 32% here. We see that slight uptick in the most recent year. That's likely due to that 12-month embargo that is allowed under the 2013 Holdren memo. So at the time these were published, that 12-month embargo was still active and still an option. So this, all these colors kind of map to federally funded publications. Then I had the question, well, what does it look like for all publications? Is this signature kind of typical for any publication that maybe doesn't have federal funding, or is this different? And so the next step is worldwide publications. This is looking at everything across the world, all publications that Dimensions had. And you can see that closed access, as we go over time, starts to decrease. It starts to step down a little bit. Maybe gold starts to increase. Green stays about the same, comes down a little bit. But what jumps out at me here is that we've got, around half and maybe well over half of all publications were closed. Whereas if we jump back up here, federally funded was around a quarter. So I could say that, papers that acknowledge US federal funding are already much less likely to be published closed access and more likely to be published green, deposited in a green repository. Instead of 5%, these are, around 30%. So there are already some major differences in kind of the characteristics and the ways that federally funded research was being provided when compared to any sort of typical or random paper, and those differences will become more stark as time goes on. So now that we've looked at open access as a whole, I'm going to break it down by publisher, and then I'm going to break it down by journal title. And then that will be the end of this section. Okay. So now that we've introduced open access status, we're going to combine it with some other stuff. Again, you can always click the box to check the data behind the graphs. Just gonna close that again. And so this is actually my favorite part of this website here. So what we have is different ways that you can sort. So all this radio button here, you can select how you want these graphs to be sorted. So I've got numbers rank 1 through 16 of whatever you selected. So in this case, we're going to do the total number of federally funded publications. So if you remember way back at the top, the publisher graph, start at the bottom, or start at the top vertically and work your way down. That's what I'm going to look at. Who has the most federally funded publications? Ranks number 1 through 16. So Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, so on and so on. And then below that will be ranks 17 through 32. So I'm going to give you the top 32 of whatever method of sorting that you want, that you're interested in. And then once I've returned those top 32, I'm going to color code by open access status. So Elsevier, Springer Nature, Wiley are all large publishers that publish, a lot of federally funded research, but around 30% of that is closed. IEEE and ACS, numbers 4 and 5, have much higher percentages published at close at around 50 to 60%. And so these publishers may be more vulnerable to the change in policies by making their previously paywalled content now publicly and openly available immediately upon acceptance. Pure gold publishers such as MTPI, Frontiers, PLOS, those are kind of appear strikingly as pure yellow, and these could presumably operate in the same way that they do today once the OSTP memo takes effect. We could change the manner of sorting. So let's look at who has the highest percentage of closed access on federally funded research. Now, the Entomological Society of Washington, the Humboldt Field Research Institute, right? Emerald, Brill, SAE. It's around 3/4. If we go down here to the next set, here's IEEE at 60% again. And so, all the gray has to go away from these graphs is kind of the takeaway. These federally funded publications will no longer be allowed to be behind a paywall. They need to be made publicly available, open access in some form. So you can play around with the sorting, look at, the different ways things fall out, try to detect, we've got Walters Kluwer as the highest, maybe green open access provider of federally funded research over these 5 years. And so on, right? That's 1 through 16. Here's 17 through 32 in rank. So moving on down here, instead of looking at publisher, we're going to look at journal title. Now, this is the last group of charts on this website, and it's the exact same thing that we saw before. So the top 3 journal titles are all 100% gold, Scientific Reports, PLOS One, Nature Communications. And so again, those journals could presumably continue operating as they are today, even after the new OSTP memo takes effect. Let's see, conversely, the FASEB journal, the Journal of the American Chemical Society, ACS Applied Materials and Interfaces will need to adjust their policies and strategy. This gray bar will not be allowed anymore once 2026 comes around. So again, here's numbers 1 through 16. We can come down here, 17 through 32 of whatever filtering criteria you prefer. And then at the bottom again, my contact information. So there's a lot of data, a lot of things to look at here. Possibly it's too much, but I wanted to give you a flavor and overview of how I tried to make this rich data set that I was able to get from Dimensions. There's almost an infinite number of questions you can ask, and I can't really summarize all those in just like one PDF file, one article. And so I wanted to make this open and available for folks to explore and look around and see what interests them, ask questions that I didn't think of asking, and try to figure out the scope and the impact of the OSTP memo. I wanted to take a brief minute to show in Dimensions how you could do a similar analysis, maybe more targeted to your specific institution or your situation. And so you should be seeing now the Dimensions home screen. So when I made my funder group, right, I had to go through and construct that myself. Dimensions was kind enough then to take that and use that as a starting point and create a global funder group. So if you go into groups, funder groups, and then it is down here below the fold, so it's US, hit more, and it's US federal funders. This group right here will allow you to run a similar analysis to what I was able to do. If I say limit to, and then we could actually just go publication year, let's just 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, limit to. I've got 1.4 million results, and maybe I'll just do remove the preprints, exclude. And there you go. So now you've basically done the same search scope that I did. If you want to use these analytical views over here on the right side, click that. Things fly out, and we can look at publishers. How does this break down by the top 500 publishers in order of decreasing number of publications? Click export table, boom, you've got all that stuff exported. If you wanted to, maybe look at the impact, maybe more focused on your university, you can come to research organization. Again, I was Iowa State. We had like 10,000 or so. Yeah, 9,900. And then come out here to analytical views and maybe look at source titles. So where did my campus publish our federally funded research? We were mostly in Physical Review B and D, High Energy Physics, Journal of Animal Science, right? So there's all kinds of things you can ask. And this US federal funders group is really what makes it possible to do. And that should be a global setting that anyone with a Dimensions account can get at. And you can do this this really kind of high-level analysis very quickly with 4 clicks, and we've got it. And these analytical views really summarize things quite nicely, I thought. So again, groups, funder groups, more US federal funders is where you'd find that. And I think Shannon, I'm about ready to turn it back over to you. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Eric. So we're just going to jump briefly back into slides. And this is brief, I promise. But what we covered a number of resources, but I just want to first say, I hope this was helpful going as a first step in terms of understanding the open access landscape and the state of federally funded research. And we also hope that you can apply it to your own institution as a means of finding where your researchers are publishing and what OA pathways they're currently using. If you are interested in learning more about how to conduct a similar bibliometric analysis at your institution using Dimensions, we encourage you to reach out to Dimensions, or you can reach out directly to me. My contact information will be at the end of this presentation, along with Eric's. I also encourage you to visit Eric's website and to play around with the data yourself. As you can see, there's lots you can do. You can search for your own institution, specific publishers. And all of these links we have included in today's slides. So this should be easily accessible to you. So you'll see here we have a list to some of the resources that were mentioned in the slides, as well as Eric's published study and the interactive versions of Eric's graphs. I do want to mention that we do have another upcoming webinar with ACRL Choice. So other ways institutions are starting to prepare is starting to review their system capabilities in terms of data management and reporting capabilities, as well as considering how they'll be able to support their researchers. This webinar is from our sister company Figshare, and it'll be covering weighing the benefits of research data management infrastructure for the library. So looking more at those data sharing practices, as well as the repository aspect that the OSTP memo highlights. And if you are interested, this is a free 60-minute webinar on April 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It will also be recorded as well. You can use the QR code to register, but it'll also be included in the slides. So if you're interested in diving more deep into this topic in terms of the implementation side as it relates to data sharing, I encourage you to register. So with that, we are going to move into the Q&A portion of our webinar today. I want to thank everyone for all of your comments in the chat. It's been really great seeing some of this conversation that's been happening. I'm going to dive in right away with a question for Eric. If you do have more questions, please continue to add them to the Q&A. Anything that we don't get to today, Eric and I are happy to reach out to you after our webinar. So I want to start with our first question because it gives Eric some praise. This is a very impressive analysis. So thank you, Eric.
Sure, thank you.
Is there any plan to update your database to include 2022 or possibly annually beyond 2022? So looking at the date range you chose for your study.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, 2022 is not included here. So I ran this in October of 2022. So the year wasn't over yet. And even though we are now in 2023, right, the calendar year 2022 is over. But typically I don't look at the previous year until like even August timeframe, just because it takes kind of that long for databases, not only Dimensions, but Web of Science, Scopus to kind of ingest all those papers and metadata and get them into the database. As we saw, even if you run it from 2017 through 2021, from October to today, it was 1.3 million in October, it's 1.4 million today. So they're always kind of adding more papers, more results, more records. But I typically don't look at a full calendar year until even 8 months into the next year. So I would say we're not really close to being ready to look at 2022 yet. And I don't really plan to update this every year and publish a new paper every year. I don't think anyone cares about that. I shouldn't say that. But probably locally we will keep track of this and do an update. I think hopefully I showed how the funder group works, and that's global now. So everyone should be able to construct this type of query and kind of update it for your own specific case. But I would really caution against looking at 2022 until kind of more time into 2023 that those records are able to get into the database, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Eric. Another question is, I assume that the open access status graph only includes the official publication. Might it be interesting to try to see how many of the closed publications are actually available via preprints or in institutional repositories?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this gets into Unpaywall and how kind of they classify the access of a paper, of a DOI. Institutional repositories are included in Unpaywall, but Unpaywall will determine kind of what they call the best OA location of a publication based on, they have this algorithm. So they prefer publisher provided access over, so they'll prefer kind of hybrid or gold over green. If they can find both, it will return only the gold. So I think the Unpaywall API does allow you to look at all the different status of a paper that it can find. So for example, my paper, I did publish on arXiv, but there is a preprint version of my journal article out there. So if you were to run my study through Unpaywall, it'll return, it found it on arXiv and it found it on the MIT website. So there's a green version and a gold version. So I can get into that with Unpaywall, but Dimensions will return only the best OA location as Unpaywall determines it. So if you ran my paper in Dimensions, it would only say gold. It wouldn't show you there was also a green option. And so I didn't really go through and say like how many duplicate colors are available on US federally funded research, but what that means is if the only copy that Unpaywall could find was in an institutional repository, it will return that as green. And so that status, that mode of access likely will increase with the OSTP guidance going forward, because they say, it needs to be made publicly available immediately in, an agency designated repository or something. And so green is one way that you would still be able to comply with the OSTP requirements, basically. And I do kind of envision that mode of access increasing in the future, but we'll kind of have to wait and see. Unpaywall should be able to pick that up though, because it does return only one, what they again call best status per paper.
Thank you, Eric. Another question, which I think is some nice food for thought, is would it also help to further analyze the federal funding publishing relationship into economically significant areas of research science? So I don't know, Eric, that's something that you've thought of in terms of where exactly the research is coming from.
Yeah, Dimensions does have kind of a field what do you call it? Research categories. I guess I'm not sure in the question of the economically significant areas. I feel like could be up for interpretation, but Dimensions does classify things into research categories. I think it's like an Australian research classification system. So engineering, physical sciences, chemical sciences, math, all kinds of things. And that is one thing included in those analytical views when that flies out from the right-hand side is research categories. So you can look and see, maybe of US federally funded research, where does that tend to be? Is it like, mostly NIH or NSF, those broad fields of research? How are those affected?
And I'll add to that too. There's group filters available as well. So let's say you're curious how this impacts HBCUs, so a group of institutions, you could apply that as well if you want to get even more specified. Other option too, if you're interested in collaboration and how many of these are collaborative with maybe countries, let's say in Latin America, you could also apply a similar filter. So there's lots of options. One of the things about this is that it is quite new. So there's lots of opportunities for deeper bibliometric analysis. Eric got kind of in the forefront, he got in the front of it, but I'm hoping, and I think we'll see a lot more that comes of this. But one nice thing is that with Dimensions and other bibliometric kind of databases, we can conduct this study and start to understand before a lot of this is implemented in 2025 and beyond, what some of those impacts look like and what are some of the opportunities in terms of accessibility as well as kind of equity when it comes to research sharing and publishing. So thank you for that question. Other questions. One question was that we realize this is a global perspective. Can we look at it from a US perspective and calculate what percentage of papers published in the US that fall under the memo? I think this may just require a point of clarity, Eric, in terms of how you identified publications with the dimensions and how you define that. So I don't know if you can just briefly walk us through.
Yeah, the x-axis on all those plots was publications worldwide, so total. I suppose I could change that so the x-axis was just limited to the United States. I did, what was it? I think it was 33%, yeah. So the 1.3 million federally funded papers over those 5 years does represent 33% of all US domestic research output over those 5 years. So I don't have that broken down by publisher or by journal title, but just as a broad number, that was 33% of output from the United States.
Thank you. And if anyone wants to talk about any of these questions in more detail or have additional follow-up questions, again, you can always reach out to Eric and I after this webinar using the emails you see on the slide here.
Yeah, happy to take questions later on as well.
Another question, I think this is kind of goes back to the origin of the study, Eric, and why you kind of built this is how does this data compare to the economic analysis that the OSTP released with the memo?
Yeah, the OSTP did release a companion report or analysis. Speaking personally, this is again my own view and not the view of Iowa State or anything. I was a little disappointed in that report. It just kind of it made some assumptions that I didn't feel like it really justified, and didn't go very deep. I didn't feel. So that OSTP economic impact memo quoted. Or they estimated 195,000 to 263,000 publications annually. And I found 265,000. So mine was agreed with the high end of that range. So I said 265, they said 195 to 263. So in that sense, they agreed roughly, more or less. But what I really would have liked to have seen was kind of what I ended up investigating is how does this break down then? You gave me a number, but who's going to be affected? Who will need to maybe change their practices or their approach more or less than some others? How can we expect different actors to react or be affected by this? Maybe what I would call a massive change. I was certainly caught by surprise. I'd seen things from UKRI and Plan S in Europe. And kind of saying, I wonder why we can't do something like that here. And then lo and behold, August 2022, it caught me completely off guard. So, I think there's still plenty of questions that remain unanswered. There's probably some ramifications that will come through that maybe I certainly don't anticipate, or others may not anticipate. But yeah, the OSTP research, what do they call it? Economic impact memo, I thought was a little too broad, and just kind of gave a range that I thought was very vague. And so I wanted a little more detail on what that would mean.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where the 2022 memo had more detail, but still there's a lot of detail lacking in terms of what this looks like in actuality and how it'll be implemented. So lots of conversations to come, but at least we can get an understanding of the impact, the initial impact of this in terms of federally funded research and open access landscape. Another question is, has any research been done on which papers that receive the highest altmetric scores are federally funded by year? My understanding, Eric, this is not something that you tackled.
This is not, no.
But this is actually an area that I'm particularly interested as someone that kind of straddles dimensions and altmetric. From my understanding, there has not been one yet, but now I'm going to be thinking about this maybe for a possible future webinar. There's been a number of studies of how open access articles do tend to have higher altmetric attention or more altmetric attention. So that is something that we've seen and papers have been written about by other researchers. But it would be really interesting to see how this applies to federal funding. I have a feeling, I would like to think that the more open access it is, the higher altmetric attention will grow and the more we'll see sharing online, but it would be able to see what this looks like currently for federally funded research. So thank you for that suggestion. I'm going to be keeping that in my back pocket, Stacy. So there is lots of comments in the chat. So I do in the Q&A, so I do encourage people to kind of open up and go through it. Some of these kind of tackle the OSTP memo directly. One of which is questions like, that you would like to hear an expert describe and discuss the meaning ramifications of machine readable as part of those OSTP list. I know, again, lots of detail, but not so much specificity in terms of what this looks like. One thing I'll note is that some of this will fall on institutions, some will fall on federal funders, and others will fall on publishers. As someone that comes from a journal background, as well as working at a institutional press, I have a feeling that some of this will probably fall back onto the publisher in terms of the accessible formats, with the idea that they can be read by accessibility. So I'm not an expert on that, but it's a good note and something that I've seen pop up a few times in the roundtables and sessions I've attended on OSTP. Another comment and something for food for thought, I think, is I would also be curious about how open access is financed. So would there be patterns to be discerned between financing of open access and federal funding of the research that is published? I think, Eric, your kind of charts at the end in terms of those levels of open access kind of starts to bridge this a bit, but probably an area we could dig a little deeper in.
Yeah, when you talk about financing, I mean, that is part of the, one of the big unanswered or open questions here is, how will this be paid for? Can you use federal grant monies to pay, say, an article processing charge or an APC? And if so, will that mean that APCs get more expensive because now more money is available to pay those charges? Some folks use institutional funds. Some libraries provide funds. Not all, I should say, not all open access requires paying money, right? So green open access requires there to be a repository. Perhaps it's your institutional repository that your library or Office of Research supports. So there's some money in that way, but there is no direct cost to you to deposit a version of your manuscript in a green open access repository. There's Diamond open access. There's Subscribe to Open that makes papers open access. So not all open access requires money and requires funding. I think it's important to be clear about that. But tracking, the funding of papers that are made available open access because they were paid for is not something that I think I'm able to do. I think that's it's very complicated and perhaps, I don't want to say impossible, but there are so many different threads coming together maybe to pay that I just don't see how you could really get under the hood at, institution ABC pays for it like this because it's got certain departments or the library kicks in this and that's a 5% discount, but they have an agreement with the publisher to get another 10%. It's all very custom and very bespoke and very individual. And so I'm not aware of any data source that would allow us to do any sort of kind of comprehensive overview of the funding to pay open access charges, unfortunately.
I think I'm going to make this our last question, but one that Stephen Diggs put in is that he suspects that many of the webinar attendees today would like to take this analysis and tweak it to tell how far out of compliance their own institutions are for the same time period. This is when I'll remind that Eric has been very kind in making all of this openly available, including how we put many of these visualizations together. And also shout out to Eric for thanking him for that very nice way to highlight your certain data points. So you could highlight your institutions, your publishers. I guess for me, Eric, I'm curious if there's anything that you found surprising or reaffirming as you kind of gone through these different data sets, and feel free to be as broad. It could be about your institution or just in general. Any final thoughts?
It kind of came out because I was doing this for Iowa State from Dimensions, and I thought, well, hang on, if I can do this pretty easily for Iowa State, I bet I could do it for everything. Like I could just back up, just take that filter out and just do the same thing. And so it scaled really nicely. Dimensions I really like using Dimensions. I find it easy to get around and export things. But I think what's really been gratifying is hearing from folks that have read the paper or discovered the website and said, this is really helpful. Someone from the NSF, the National Science Foundation, emailed me and said, we want you to know that this is informing federal policy. Like they're using this at the NSF as they write their own public access policy. And that was really, really cool to hear. I've heard from publishers, I've heard from consultants, I've heard from consortia, I've heard from individual, librarians and associate university librarians that, just saying thank you, but also asking deeper questions like Stephen Diggs asks here, like, how would we do this for our own? Or can you show me what my number is? And I'm happy to have those conversations and talk more, but I really like it when something that I did is being used by other people, right? So I want to make it not only so that Iowa State can look at it, but I want to open it up so that anybody else can do a similar analysis. So I can kind of replicate myself and I can appear at your campus and say, well, this is how it kind of looks for you all. So so that's been really nice to hear. And so if anyone has questions, again, either now or later on as you're watching the recording, I'm happy to take those questions and chat.
Thanks, Eric. There's been a number of nice comments about your work. I will not embarrass you by reading them out.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
But I recommend you take a peek at the Q&A after this. So thank you again, Eric, for taking the time, for doing all this work and sharing it with all of us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sabrina for some final words.
Great. Thanks so much, Shannon. And so thank you both to Shannon and Eric for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your engagement with your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording, as well as where to access the slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the session and hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.